Hello and welcome to this Davinci Resolve tutorial on how to grade your color from this very dull kind of look to something a lot more stylish, fully white balanced, and has a LUT attached to it. So this is going to be a complete workflow for people who are totally new to Davinci Resolve and you want to just get something from a bad looking clip to something that looks a lot better. I've gone for this very mundane clip because I was in the midst of making a tutorial for my mother-in-law on how to use a camera with the basics. And I thought, why not just throw together Davinci Resolve Basics tutorial as well to be extra meta. So let's go for it. I'm using Davinci Resolve 15. This will probably be the same for 13 and up until they change something drastic. Davinci Resolve is free. It's awesome. Go download it from the Blackmagic Design website. And it's really the best thing out there for color grading, and it's getting a lot better in terms of the editing workflow as well. I currently use it for pretty much everything. You can see from the bottom here, it does everything from edit to fusion, which is like After Effects, like Node Graph, color grading, Fairlight, which is a big audio mastering suite, and then Deliver, which is their export or share in Final Cut terms. So I'm going to show you just how to bring in a bit of footage, color grade it, get it white balanced, and some of the basics that Davinci Resolve has to offer. So you can see I shot this basically explaining how to use a camera to my mother-in-law. And I've shot it in a very, very yellowy light. Doesn't look good at all. So it's really the perfect candidate to show you how the basics of color work in Davinci Resolve. So the first thing I would do with this clip is to jump over to color when I want to grade it. So what you'll see is as you have several clips, so if I put a cut into this one with the B for blade, now have two different clips. Then in the color, you'll see that you've got two different clips. So that's just an easy way for it to explain all the different cuts in your grade. And it's also easy to copy grades across. So when you go to each grade, they're each a different graph. And grading really works around this idea of this frame graph. So this graph over here is basically from input to output, all the different changes you make, and you can add an immeasurable amount of different changes. You can add multiple changes onto a single one as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is to set up white balance. So currently I've got my master frame, and I usually leave that one blank with nothing on it. It's just how I do it. And then the first thing I'm going to do is add a serial node. So you can do Alt and S for serial, to get a new node, or you can right click and say add node, add serial. So basically serial meaning that it's just going in a linear line through. You can do things in parallel, but we're not going to talk about that in this tutorial. So the first thing I'm going to do is to isolate an area that I know should be white. So this is on a plain white table. So what I'm going to do is use this tool, the window tool, to select only an area that I think should be white. So I'm going to add this, which we call an isolator, this black box to this, and then I'm going to resize it down like that so that it just looks like basically just the white part is selected. You'll notice in Resolve that you also have the ability to kind of feather these selection boxes. We really don't want that, so I'm just going to make sure it's really just covering that white part. I've got kind of a shadow there, but generally speaking, if we put somewhere that we think should be white, we'll be able to use that in combination with the tools that we've got to get our white balance. Once we've got the isolator to where we want it, then what we can do is click this magic wand button here called highlight, which basically takes the window that we've put in, or the isolator we've put in, and only shows us that. Now what this means is that when we go to our scopes, so if you click on this button over here called scopes, then you get an idea of, well, basically the scopes represent only what is highlighted. So this small box here, not the R, G, and B, red, green, and blue of the entire image, because that's hard to work with. We can't really guess as to whether we've got good white balance when there's all kinds of different colors in the scene. But if we just select a part that we think should be white, then we've got a good RGB. So now what we can do is try and balance these out. And we do that using this area here. So the RGB mixer. So 1, 2, 3, fourth button in from the left, RGB mixer. You've then got red output, green output, and blue output. So what we're trying to do is balance the levels of these three things. Now it's quite difficult to see, so I'm zooming in so I can show you. But basically we're adjusting red on the red output, green on the green output, and blue on the blue output. And trying to basically match them together. So the first thing I notice is that the red is kind of higher up than these two. So I'm going to move the blue up a little bit. I can move the red down a little bit. Now, obviously moving this down, moving the slider down on red, reducing the red, doesn't mean that this is going to go down. It's kind of inverse in that sense. But we basically want to get to a point where we're balancing all three. And when you move each one, you'll notice it affects the others slightly as well. So I can see that around here, and this will be different obviously for every shot, but that is roughly the same. And you can see that my square has gone from a yellow to now a kind of a grey. Then when I switch off my magic wand, I can still see that that's still just the area highlighted. I select this square in the window panel and I click on the square to switch it off. So now I have a white balanced image. And what you can see by bypassing the color grade, which you can do with this button up here, bypass color grades and fusion effects. That's the difference that we've made so far. So a nice white balance that balances everything out. So that's great. And you can name these nodes. So you right click and go to node label. I'm going to call this WB for white balance. For some reason, Davinci Resolve is very flaky in terms of typing. Often it will just lose focus on the UI. So click back and retype it. So that's my white balance. I'm now going to add another node. So remember Alt-S, add serial node. And this time I'm going to balance out the areas of light and dark. So this time on the vector scopes, remember this button down here, I'm going to change from the parade of RGB over to a waveform. Now I've shot this clip with my Sony a7 III with quite a flat color profile. I think it's either S-Log 2 or 3. And what you can see with that is that we've got a vector scope a waveform that looks like this. Now the problem with this is that there's not a lot of highlights and the darks aren't all the way to the very baseline either. So what we're trying to do with this is to even that out, or to kind of fill up the full dynamic range of what we can show. So I'm going to go to my color wheels section on the left here. And I'm looking now at the lift, gamma, gain, and offset. So lift being the dark parts, gamma being the middle parts, and gain being the highlights. And offset is kind of like a mix of the whole three. So I don't tend to use that much. So the dials at the bottom, which go left to right, it's like a wheel that you turn. You see, as I turn that, you can see now that the scopes are moving. And what I want to do is change the lift, just move it down a little bit until those dark parts are basically meeting the baseline of what we can render. And then likewise with the gain, I'm going to pull that all the way up. Well, maybe not all the way up. I mean, obviously use your eye as well. Look at what's on the screen and decide for yourself. But typically you would crank that all the way up until you've nearly blown out your picture. So let's just go with that for the sake of argument. Do it technically, and then we'll worry about how it looks a bit later. So I've brought the top of this up nearly to the top of my scope. So I've got a bit of headroom. Nothing is blown out. Nothing is too bright. So there's nothing where you would, in a camera see zebra lines to show you that it's too bright. But basically, this is now the full range. And then I can think about color grading this image. So the next thing I'm going to do is to just label that. So I'm going to, I'll just call this contrast. And you can see it loses focus all the time. It's really bad for that. So contrast, and it lost focus before I finished typing that time. Node label, contrast, there we go. And I'm going to Alt-S for another serial node. I'm just going to move it down here for tidiness. And this time I'm going to look at something kind of stylized. So I'm going to go to my curves window. And this time I might reduce a little bit of each end of the picture. And I can also click to add another point, and I can make it look stylistically how I want. So I can play around with that curve and bring some of the highlights down. So this, obviously this top right is the highlights. Play around with those, flatten them out a little bit. So it's just like a curve editor in something like Photoshop. Now I'm going to get that to a kind of a flat look again, because the last point in this is where I'm going to use a lookup table or a LUT, which there are quite a lot built into Davinci Resolve. And so this one I'm going to call LUT prep, because it's basically my last step before I'm adding a lookup table. Now, a lookup table, for those of you who don't know, basically a lookup table is kind of like a predefined look for an image. It's kind of like, think of it kind of like an Instagram filter. It's kind of applied over the top of the whole thing. It's got a bunch of settings baked into it, and it will give you a certain stylistic look, certain changes to colors, certain changes to the light and dark of an image. So what I'm going to do to get a LUT is simply to right click on my node that I want it on and go to LUTs. And there's one that I quite like. There's a lot in here to play with, which is really great. They're mostly under 3D LUTs, and you can go through all of these and play with them. One that I really like is Film Looks Kodak. It's the first one in the list of Kodaks at the bottom of the list. So Film Looks Kodak, Rec 709 Kodak 2383D55. Very easy to remember, but basically that one I like quite a lot. And when I apply it, it's quite a stark grade. It's quite a serious look to the thing. So what I'm going to do is to just change the amount to which that is applied. Now you can do that using this button here. So this is the key, and in key you can basically also define how much output there is of a node. So if you go to key with a node selected, the key output is basically like the opacity of that node. So if I put this at say 0.5, it's reducing the effect. If I put it on 0, there's no effect at all. So I might put this say at 0.6, so I have kind of a nice look. And just to remind ourselves how far we've come, we can click on the bypass and switch it on and off. So we've gone from a really bad flat color, badly lit, terrible colors, to a nice look with a lookup table and a certain style to it. And so if we look how that used to look in bypass, everything's kind of a bit flat and a bit dull. You switch it on and everything looks great. The paper looks white, colors are great. And there we go. So other interesting things we could do. So I'm just going to label that really quickly as the LUT. Davinci, you must get better at allowing me to type. And I'm going to leave these at the end because they're kind of like the finishing of the image. I'm just going to throw in after the contrast, I'm going to add another serial node. And I'm going to just add really quickly an example of how you can sharpen up an image. Now, sharpening is kind of cool for a few reasons. Obviously, when you normally think of sharpening an image, you think of kind of degrading it slightly. It's not typically something you would do if you're a pro and you've got things focused. You might not want to just add sharpening across the board. So the beauty of that is that we can use the selection tools in Davinci Resolve, which are called the qualifiers, and pick just a certain part of the image. Now, this isn't a great clip to do that with, but I am just going to show you how it works. So how we do that is that we would say, okay, well, we're going to use a qualifier for this particular node. And what this is doing is saying that this node will only apply to whatever qualifies to be, well, in this case, sharpened. But in other words, whatever else you put on here. So if I put a sharpening on here, if I put a LUT on here, it will only apply to the areas that I select. Currently, everything is selected. So the full range of all colors, the full range of saturation, and the full range of luminance from dark to light. Now, if I only wanted this to this sharpening, so first off, I'm going to put on some sharpening. So I click on the blur, and if you drag blur down, you get sharpening. So here is some intense sharpening, right? So drag it down, sharpens everything up. Obviously, sharpening everything, you can see here, we're getting these intense like noise everywhere. Now, if I just have a slight bit of sharpening, and again, you can bypass everything just to see the difference in the sharpening. You can see it's popping up in all of this noise. But I'm just going to put on an over-the-top amount of sharpening so that you can see what's meant to be happening there. Now, what I'm going to do to qualify that is go back to the eyedropper, the qualifier tool, and make sure it only applies to the very lightest parts. So I want to be able to sharpen up these icons. So this where it says display and 1/125th, the UI of the camera. And I want to just sharpen those. So the qualifier is great because basically it's allowing me to just select certain things. Now, I don't want anything with much saturation, so I'm going to reduce the high because I know the UI is only in white. And if I click on this magic wand, it will show me what I'm highlighting. Then I can adjust the luminance to only be certain things. So you can see here if I drag the high or if I drag the low, obviously I want to drag the low because I only want it to apply to that text. So basically I'm trying to isolate just the text. And you can see that by selecting the highlights, I've now got mostly the bits of text. Gone a little bit too far, so I'm going to increase the low soft. So that's kind of like adding feathering to that selection. Somewhere like that. Then you've got a bunch of other things like you've got clean black, so you can kind of adjust that to kind of clean up the edges around those things. And currently we've got a problem where there's kind of like a mid-range of stuff. Obviously the table's super bright. That's going to get sharpened as well. Not a huge problem in this instance because it's just a table, so that's no big deal. But something like that will allow me just to select those. So I could drop that down, but for some reason it thinks that they require some saturation, so they must just be a little bit colorful. And then we could play with hue, but I'm really addressing a white part of the image, so I'm just going to ignore that entirely. And I'm just going to sharpen those points. So I'm just going to drop the saturation down slightly. Increase some high soft. I basically want to get rid of this yellow here. But it's not happening until right at the very end. So we'll just roll with that. It's no big deal. The other thing that we can do is use an isolator again. So if I know that the camera is pretty much always in the middle, then I can add this. Remember, everything is going on to this node. So I can add this box, drag it out so that for the duration of this shot, this node is basically in charge of making sure that only these things within this frame with this qualification get sharpened. That's pretty much it. So you can see there's dots on each of these to tell you that they are in use on this node. And there's little icons to show you that they're in use on that node too. So I'm going to switch that off entirely. And now what you'll see, if you could see this a lot more clearly, is that these are sharpened. Nothing else around here is sharpened, and it's literally just sharpening that point. So if I crank this forward, then the problem with that is that for this shot, what I would do if I was editing this properly was I would cut there, because then the sharpening is going to be happening right on the middle of this piece of paper, because that carries on throughout that shot, regardless of what's in the frame. So I've got some sharpening right here, but not out around it. But anyway, so that's basically how you kind of isolate, how you color grade, how you white balance, and how you kind of prepare clips in Davinci Resolve 15. Actually, there's one more thing that I wanted to add, or a couple more things. If you wanted to move this grade from one clip to another, you can use the apply grade function. So select the one that you need to apply something to, right click on the one you want to take it from and go to apply grade, and that will just copy it across. Another thing that's useful to know is that when you're typically working on grades, you're working on them per clip. Now, you can obviously copy paste them across like I just did with apply grade, But you can also use this kind of global function called timeline, where basically you're applying changes to everything in the timeline. Now that will apply to everything, so be aware that you probably don't want to use that for too much. But if there's like a tiny little effect, maybe something in Open Effects, which is like their kind of screen space effects that you want to apply to everything, maybe you might want to do it there. But typically, you probably don't want to do that. So the other final useful thing that I wanted to mention is that there is a really useful shortcut called Shift and F, which will jump you to full screen. I should have used this during the tutorial, but I'm a terrible person and I didn't. But this is what I'm now using to show you the before and after. Shift and F will jump you from that viewer to kind of maximized view within the UI. So last two tips were apply grade. So select the one you want, right click, apply grade, the ability to switch between clip and timeline, and Shift and F on the keyboard to jump between normal and full screen mode, just to check how your grade is working out. Anyway, that really is it for now. Thank you for watching.